Hello friends again, welcome back to Shadows of Revenge. First at all tell me, where are you from the world watching my video? This is a true story, so watch till end. My name is Walter Brennan. The attorney's office smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the kind of place where lives were reduced to signatures and final sentences. Walter sat across the desk with his hands folded, feeling a strange lightness in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation, almost like hope. At 63, hope was not something that visited him often anymore. Most days were routine, predictable, quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like erasure. Then the words landed. Sole beneficiary. For a moment, Walter thought he had misheard. His mind reached for correction, for clarification, for the familiar disappointment that usually followed good news spoken too quickly. But the attorney repeated herself, calmly, precisely, as if she were reading a grocery list rather than dismantling his understanding of the last 4 decades of his life. Everything. The ranch in Montana, hundreds of acres of land stretching under open sky. The rental properties in Denver, quietly generating income month after month. The savings. The investments. Numbers were mentioned, but they blurred together, swelling into a single, overwhelming truth. His older brother, the man who lived alone and spoke rarely about money, had left him a future. Walter felt his hands tremble against each other. He was dimly aware of the attorney's kind eyes watching him, of her voice explaining details, but his thoughts were already elsewhere, back home, imagining Gloria's reaction, Marcus's surprise. He pictured his wife's face softening, his son's voice warming, the way people might finally look at him differently if they knew he wasn't just the retired man drifting through his days. When the attorney slid the envelope across the desk, Walter hesitated before touching it. Raymond's handwriting stared back at him, steady and unmistakable. His brother had never been sentimental. Letters were not his way. That alone made Walter's throat tighten. He waited until the office was empty before opening it. The words inside were calm, deliberate, and sharper than any raised voice. Raymond didn't waste space. He spoke of love, of observation, of patterns that repeated themselves quietly over years. He spoke of money not as salvation, but as revelation. And then came the warning, gentle, but unyielding. Watch them. Don't tell them yet. See who they are when they think you're just the man you've always been. Walter read the letter once, then again, slower the second time. A part of him wanted to argue with it, to defend his life, his marriage, his son. 38 years of shared history couldn't be reduced to a few paragraphs, could it? Yet another part of him, the part that had learned to stay quiet, recognized the ache of truth. The letter didn't accuse. It simply named things he had learned to ignore. By the time Walter boarded the plane home, the decision had already settled into him like a held breath. He would wait. He would watch. The house looked the same when he arrived that evening. The lights were on. The television murmured from the living room. Gloria sat on the couch, eyes fixed on the screen, barely glancing up as he stepped inside. "How was the trip?" she asked, her tone casual, distracted. "Fine," Walter said. "Just paperwork." She nodded, already done with the conversation. When she asked if Raymond had left anything, the question felt more procedural than curious, as though she were checking off an item on a mental list. "Not really," Walter replied. "The ranch went to his ranch hand. Charity got the rest." The lie tasted bitter, but he swallowed it. "That's too bad," Gloria said, and turned back to the television. That was it. No sympathy, no reflection, no shared memory of the man who had been Walter's brother. The quiet dismissal settled heavily in his chest, heavier than any argument might have been. He went to the bedroom, then to the garage, and hid the documents where Gloria never looked. Inside an old toolbox coated in dust and forgotten tools, much like himself. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Over the next few days, something shifted in Walter's vision, as if a filter had been removed. He began to notice patterns that had always been there, hiding in plain sight. Gloria talked about money constantly, about how tight things were, how retirement was draining them, how careful they needed to be. Yet her own spending never slowed. The salon appointments continued. The shopping trips continued. The casual purchases that somehow always felt justified. And then there were the comments. Small at first, almost playful. Walter never really understood finances. Walter doesn't do much now that he's retired. Walter was never ambitious. They floated through the house like background noise, the kind you stopped hearing after years of exposure. Except now, Walter heard every word. Each one landed with a clarity that made him wince. He wondered how long she had been speaking this way. He wondered how long he had been accepting it as normal. When Marcus came over for dinner later that week, Walter felt his shoulders tense before his son even walked through the door. Marcus had always been polite, efficient, affectionate in the way a busy man was affectionate, with limits and expectations. Their visits usually came with requests attached, though rarely stated outright. During dinner, Gloria mentioned Raymond again, her tone casual but pointed. Marcus's fork paused midair when he asked about the inheritance. Walter repeated the same story, watching his son's face closely this time. Marcus frowned. He asked questions, logical questions, reasonable questions, and then there was a look, quick, fleeting, shared between mother and son. It passed so fast Walter might have missed it if he hadn't been searching for it. Something unspoken moved between them, and Walter felt a coldness creep into his chest. After dinner, they went into the kitchen together. Walter stayed behind, the newspaper open in his hands, though the words swam uselessly on the page. When he rose and moved closer to the doorway, it felt like his body knew something his mind wasn't ready to accept. Their voices were low, careful. Suspicion threaded through every sentence. They spoke of money as though it were already allocated, already imagined. They spoke of Raymond as though he were a puzzle that hadn't been solved correctly. And then Gloria said it, casually, dismissively. I think your father isn't smart enough to hide anything. The words hit Walter with physical force. His breath caught. He leaned against the wall, unseen, unheard, as something inside him fractured quietly. Marcus didn't challenge the statement. He built on it, expanded it, turned it into a conversation about expectations unmet and opportunities lost. They weren't angry. They were disappointed. That, somehow, hurt more. Walter stepped back before they noticed him, returning to his chair, his paper, his roll. When they emerged, smiling and chatting like nothing had happened, the illusion of family felt thinner than paper. That night, lying beside Gloria in the dark, Walter stared at the ceiling and understood something with devastating clarity. The inheritance wasn't the miracle. The letter was. Raymond hadn't given him money. He had given him sight. And once you see clearly, you can never go back to blindness. Once the door inside him had opened, it refused to close again. Walter moved through the next few days, as if he were living in a familiar house that had suddenly revealed hidden rooms, dark, narrow spaces that had always existed but were never meant to be seen. Every interaction felt layered now. Every word carried weight. Silence itself became a language. Gloria didn't know he was watching. She complained the same way she always had, but now Walter heard the rhythm beneath it. Money was never just money. It was leverage. It was anxiety carefully cultivated and redirected. She spoke of retirement, as though it were a burden he had placed on her, as though the years he had worked had somehow inconvenienced her future. You've been distracted lately, she said one morning, her tone edged with something that sounded like concern but felt like accusation. You should really see a doctor. Memory issues at your age aren't something to ignore. Walter looked up from his coffee. The words slid into place inside his mind with disturbing ease. Memory, age, decline. A narrative was forming. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply nodded and filed the moment away. That was becoming his new habit, collecting moments, stacking them carefully, refusing to let them dissolve into doubt. After Gloria left for her hair appointment, Walter sat at the kitchen table with Raymond's letter folded neatly beside him. He reread the lines about watching and listening, about letting people reveal themselves. Then he picked up the phone. The calls he made that morning were quiet, efficient, and irreversible. A family law attorney. A conversation about protection, about separation, about what was still his. Then another call, back to Montana, to the woman who had already changed his life without meaning to. Patricia Holloway didn't sound surprised when he explained his situation. Her voice was steady, professional, reassuring. She spoke about inheritance law, about separate property, about the importance of keeping things untouched, uncontaminated. She warned him not to speak too soon, not to reveal what could still be used against him. Walter listened carefully, absorbing every word. Each sentence felt like a brick being placed beneath his feet, lifting him slowly out of something that had been suffocating him for years. By the time he hung up, he knew waiting was no longer passive. It was preparation. He opened new accounts at a different bank. He rented a safe deposit box. He moved copies of documents quietly, methodically. Then, after a moment of hesitation, he purchased a small digital recorder, sleek, unobtrusive, easy to hide. It felt wrong in his hand at first, like a betrayal of his own values. But then he remembered Gloria's voice in the kitchen. He remembered Marcus's silence. The recorder went into his shirt pocket. Marcus came over again a few days later. He claimed he wanted to help around the house, to check on his father, to be present. Walter recognized the pattern now. The pretext was always harmless. The intention rarely was. They spoke politely in front of him. Then, inevitably, Marcus and Gloria found a reason to step away together. Walter stayed where he was, heart pounding softly, fingers brushing the recorder's button. Their voices drifted down the hallway. They spoke more freely this time, frustration sharpening their words. Marcus had been researching, reading, preparing. What if you documented incidents? Marcus said. Memory lapses, confusion, poor judgment. Gloria hesitated, but only briefly. A doctor would take that seriously, she said. Of course they would, especially at his age. Dementia doesn't come out of nowhere. Walter closed his eyes as the words pressed into him. Dementia, power of attorney, control. They weren't discussing possibilities. They were drafting a plan. Walter stayed still, breathing slowly, forcing himself to hear every sentence. The recorder captured it all. The calm calculation, the lack of guilt, the assumption that his life was already something to be managed rather than lived. Later that night, alone in the garage, Walter replayed the recording. He listened once, then again. Each time, the disbelief faded, replaced by something harder and colder. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't stress talking. This was intent. Raymond had been right. The realization hurt more than anger ever could. Over the next week, Walter gathered more proof. Not because he needed it for court, but because he needed it for himself. When doubt crept in, when memory tried to soften the edges, he listened again. He let the truth hurt as much as it needed to. Gloria's comments became more pointed. She questioned his decisions. She second-guessed his actions. She hinted, subtly, that maybe she should start handling finances for his own good. Marcus echoed the concern, playing the role of worried son with unsettling ease. They thought they were being careful. They thought he was oblivious. What they didn't realize was that every whispered plan, every quiet insult, was dismantling the last remaining thread of loyalty Walter had been clinging to. 2 weeks after returning from Montana, Walter sat alone in the house and understood that waiting any longer would change nothing. He had seen enough, heard enough, felt enough. The man who had spent his life providing, protecting, and excusing was gone. In his place sat someone who finally knew the cost of staying silent, and he was done paying it. Saturday morning arrived quietly, the way life-altering days often do. Sunlight crept through the kitchen window, settling on the table where Walter had eaten breakfast for decades without ever realizing it was a battlefield. Gloria stood at the stove, moving with practiced efficiency, humming faintly as she flipped something in the pan. The normalcy of it all felt surreal, almost cruel, given what Walter now carried inside him. 2 weeks of preparation had led to this moment. 2 weeks of listening, documenting, protecting himself from people who believed he was already slipping away. Walter sat down at the table and folded his hands. His heart wasn't racing. That surprised him. What he felt instead was a heavy calm, the kind that comes after grief has burned through panic and left clarity behind. Gloria, he said evenly, I need to tell you something. She turned, spatula still in hand, irritation flickering briefly across her face. Can it wait? Breakfast is almost. No, Walter said softly. It can't. Something in his voice made her pause. She faced him fully now, eyes narrowing slightly. What is it? I lied to you about Raymond's estate. The silence that followed was razor-sharp. Gloria's expression shifted. Not dramatically, not yet. Surprise passed through her eyes, followed almost immediately by calculation. She was good at that transition. She had been practicing it for years. "What do you mean you lied?" she asked. Walter didn't rush. He didn't soften his words. Raymond didn't leave his ranch to his ranch hand. He didn't give his money to charity. He left everything to me. Her lips parted slightly. The spatula lowered a fraction of an inch. "All of it?" she asked, already moving the numbers around in her mind. "Yes," Walter said. "The ranch, the rental properties in Denver, the savings, the investments. About $1.4 million in total." For a brief moment, something raw surfaced on Gloria's face. Shock, naked and unfiltered. Then it disappeared, replaced by a smile that felt practiced, almost rehearsed. "Walter," she said warmly, stepping closer. "That's wonderful. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because Raymond warned me not to." Her smile faltered. "Just slightly." "Warned you about what?" "About you," Walter said. He reached into his pocket and placed the small digital recorder on the table between them. It looked insignificant there, harmless even. Gloria stared at it, as though it might bite. "He left me a letter," Walter continued. "He told me that money doesn't change people. It reveals them. He told me to watch, to listen, to wait." Gloria's voice tightened. "I don't understand what you're implying." Walter pressed a button. Her own voice filled the kitchen, clear and unmistakable. "I think your father isn't smart enough to hide anything." The color drained from her face. Walter skipped forward. Marcus's voice followed, calm and deliberate. "If Dad gets diagnosed with dementia, you could get power of attorney." The room felt smaller with every word that echoed through it. Gloria didn't speak. She couldn't. The truth had stepped out of hiding and now stood between them, undeniable. Walter turned the recorder off. "You were planning to have me declared incompetent," he said quietly. "You and our son. You were going to take control of my finances and wait for me to die." Gloria's mouth opened, then closed. When she finally spoke, her voice shook, not with remorse, but with urgency. "You're misunderstanding. You took things out of context. We were just talking." "What context makes that acceptable?" Walter asked. His tone never rose. That, more than anything, unsettled her. He reached into his pocket again and placed a thick envelope on the table. "These are divorce papers," he said. "I'm filing on Monday." The word divorce landed like a drop plate. "You can't be serious," Gloria said, finally finding her voice. "After 38 years. Walter met her eyes. "How many of those years did you actually love me, Gloria? And how many was I just useful?" She didn't answer. The front door opened then, footsteps echoing down the hall. Marcus appeared in the doorway, smiling automatically, until he saw the scene before him. "What's going on?" he asked. Gloria didn't hesitate. "Your father's lost his mind," she said. "He's talking about divorce." Walter looked at his son, at the man he had raised, supported, trusted. He pressed play again. Marcus's own voice filled the room this time. "If you document incidents, a doctor would take it seriously." Marcus went pale. "That's, Dad, you took that out of context." Walter turned off the recorder. "What context makes it okay to plan stealing your father's life by calling it concern?" Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. His eyes flicked to his mother, then back to Walter. "Uncle Raymond left you everything," he said slowly. "Yes." "How much?" Walter stood. "That's no longer any of your concern." In an instant, the unity between mother and son cracked. Gloria turned on Marcus, accusing him of filling her head with ideas. Marcus shot back that she'd been obsessed with money long before he ever mentioned anything. Their voices rose, words tumbling out, years of resentment surfacing without restraint. Walter watched them with a strange detachment. This was who they were when a mask fell. He walked toward the door, slipping his jacket on as their argument escalated behind him. "I'm staying at a hotel tonight," he said. "My attorney will be in touch. I suggest you both get lawyers." No one tried to stop him. As he drove away, the house shrinking in his rearview mirror, Walter felt something lift from his chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was release. For the first time in decades, he wasn't walking on eggshells inside his own life. He was walking away. The divorce did not explode the way Walter once imagined endings were supposed to. There were no public scenes, no dramatic reconciliations, no apologies whispered too late at night. Instead, it unfolded slowly, methodically, like paperwork grinding a long-dead marriage into official dust. For months. That was how long it took to legally dismantle 38 years. Gloria fought harder than Walter expected, not out of heartbreak, but out of entitlement. Her attorney argued technicalities, implied concealment, suggested that family inheritance should count as shared destiny. Each claim was dismantled piece by piece, not with emotion, but with fact. The law did not care about what Gloria felt she deserved. It cared about timelines, accounts, and separation. And on those points, Walter's footing was solid. The recordings never played in open court, but they hovered over the proceedings like a silent witness. Patterns emerged. Motives became clearer. The judge listened with a patience that did not translate into sympathy. When it ended, Gloria received the house and half of what had been jointly built. Walter kept his pension. And Raymond's legacy, every acre, every dollar, remained untouched. Marcus vanished from Walter's life the moment the papers were filed. There were no angry messages, no attempts at explanation. Silence replaced obligation, and for the first time, Walter didn't chase it. Through others, he heard fragments Denise hadn't known. The truth had detonated inside Marcus's marriage. Counseling, distance, consequences that could not be rewound. Walter felt no triumph in any of it, only finality. 6 months after the divorce was complete, Walter packed what he needed and drove north. Mile by mile, the familiar roads gave way to open land, wider skies, and a silence that felt honest rather than hollow. When he reached the ranch, the wind moved through the grass like a slow breath, and the mountains stood exactly where Raymond had said they would, unchanged, unbothered by human disappointment. The house was sturdy and worn in the way of things that had been cared for without vanity. The barn smelled of hay and old wood. Horses moved calmly in the pasture, their presence grounding, indifferent to inheritance and betrayal. Eddie met him at the gate. Nothing extravagant was said, no speeches, just a handshake, firm and steady, the kind that carried respect without needing to announce it. Walter kept Eddie on as ranch manager, raised his pay, and offered him and his wife one of the guest cabins. The gratitude in Eddie's eyes said more than words ever could. The first few months were harder than Walter admitted to anyone. Nights stretched long. Silence pressed in. There were moments, sitting alone on the porch as the sun dropped behind the mountains, when doubt crept close enough to touch. He wondered if starting over at 63 was courage or denial, if peace was real or just the absence of conflict. Then spring arrived. One morning, Walter woke to birdsong instead of tension. He stepped outside with his coffee and watched the fields soften into green, watched the light catch on snow-dusted peaks in the distance. Something loosened in his chest. A quiet, unfamiliar feeling settled in. Contentment. Life began to fill itself in around him, not loudly, not all at once. Neighbors waved as they passed. Someone dropped off a casserole simply because they'd heard he was new. Walter joined a small poker group that met weekly at a bar where everyone knew each other's names and nobody asked what you were worth. He started fishing again, not for sport, for memory, for the quiet companionship of water and time. He thought of Raymond often then, not with grief, but with gratitude. It was at a hardware store in town that Walter met Margaret. She was reaching for something on a high shelf, frowning slightly, clearly determined not to ask for help. Walter offered anyway. She laughed, a quick, genuine sound, and thanked him as if it mattered. Coffee followed, then dinner, then more coffee. Margaret was 60, a widow, and carried her loss without bitterness. She didn't ask about money. She didn't measure him. She listened. She spoke honestly. Being with her felt easy in a way Walter hadn't realized life could be. They didn't rush. They didn't label. They simply shared time. And it was enough. One afternoon, months later, Walter walked to the edge of the ranch where Raymond was buried. The grave overlooked the valley, just as his brother had wanted. Walter sat in the grass and talked. Not formally, not reverently, just honestly. He spoke about the ranch, about Margaret, about learning to ride properly, finally, about how quiet his life had become, and how that quiet no longer frightened him. "You were right," Walter said into the wind. About all of it. The breeze moved through the grass, and for a moment, Walter could almost hear Raymond's laugh, the low, knowing sound of a man who had seen the ending before anyone else. Now, at 64, Walter no longer measured his life by what he provided or who depended on him. He measured it by mornings that felt calm, by evenings that didn't require performance, by relationships that didn't need leverage to survive. Raymond's letter hung framed on the wall inside the house, beside a photograph from their last fishing trip. Walter read the final line every morning, not as a reminder of loss, but as permission. You spend your whole life taking care of everyone else. It's time to take care of yourself. Walter finally had. And for the first time in decades, the future didn't feel like something he was waiting to exit. It felt like something he was allowed to live.